Recording. Hey guys, welcome to Two or Three Gathered, all of you twos and threes.
Fellow heathens.
Yeah, hey. Today we have got a fun video for you. It's a bit of a thought-provoking one, a bit of a fun one for us, especially seems to be for that Jared has done a lot of research into this one. He is going to be our resident scholar today. We are going to be talking about William Lane Craig's 9 arguments for theism. But in the meantime, how's that been? Looking up this one for you, Jared.
It's been good, man. Like, I mean, this is a bit of like it has a personal influence on my own testimony and like actually how I form thoughts around my Christian worldview. So yeah, like I would say these arguments arrived at have been added to as my understanding is of each of the arguments. I've written about it personally in my own blog, which we will link in the description.
Oh.
Shameless self-plug. And basically it was a chance for me to kind of like write a love letter, honoring God with my mind to Christ, to actually say, yeah, this is why actually Christian worldview cohesively makes sense of our world better than I think any worldview does. It's so as well as being a very deliberate homage to William Lane Craig's process when he publicly debates and how he often presents what is his 9 arguments for Christian theism. This is also my added 2 parts of actually what's why I believe what I believe. In summary, not exhaustively, if that makes sense.
Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, that sounds like a good description, because I mean, as I've looked into the world of apologetics and theology and the crossover there, I've found William Lane Craig, he's just an absolute, he's a genius, and he's a powerhouse of the mind, and the way that he's brought different arguments and philosophical and theological concepts together has always been really impressive. So yeah, this one's definitely looking like a fun one to tackle.
But he's like fatherly, right? Like you'd see yourself grabbing a beer, grabbing a coffee with the guy too. Eh?
Yeah,
like
yeah,
elder at your local church kind of vibe. Hey,
yeah. Only if he grows the beard back.
Oh boy,
There's an entire Facebook group.
Yeah.
Dedicated. It's titled the case for the resurrection of William Lane Craig's beard. He has actually addressed this and said that he doesn't think he looks good with the beard, which is just, you know what, I'm going to
wait, are you looking up the picture as well?
Yeah, I
was legitimately doing the same thing.
So I'll bring up some, just getting some images here. We've this is, so he's also said that he doesn't think his wife would be too happy with it, but I don't know. I think his wife would probably want the world to experience this. This is William Lane Craig back in about the 70s, or the 80s, maybe even later, but I think 70s, 80s, before he had the salt and pepper growing in.
Are you more a fan of the salt and pepper or less?
Oh, I think he rocks the silver fox look just fine.
He looks like Spurgeon. He looks like Charles Spurgeon.
So this is great. This is a glimpse into the future. This is our prophetic truth right here, and revelation. And yeah, there are plenty of memes of bring back the beard, and here we go. We've got the 5 points of Beardism, the tulip, irresistible manliness and perseverance of the whiskers, definitely. Yeah, limited trimming. Yeah, it's this is something that William Lane Craig needs to address. It is the only heresy in his the only major heresy in his delivery and in his messaging.
Up until that point, I'd never realized how much John Calvin looked like William Lane Craig, and I don't know if that's a point in his favor or a point against him, but
Yeah,
you know, we try to appeal to everyone here at 2 or 3 Gathered, so you know,
yeah,
take it all you want.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, let's roll on our intro.
Let's do it.
So, 2 or 3 Gathered is a series of conversations with Christian brothers and sisters, considering their efforts and contributions to to the kingdom vocationally, their stories and testimonies of God's sovereignty and grace, and an opportunity to tackle the relevant issues that the church faces in the 21st century.
In this, we seek to equip the saints by networking within the body, starting the conversation around often taboo subjects, and seeking to develop unity across Christian denominations and traditions by starting conversation on such worthy topics.
We want to educate the wider body of Christ by asking experts and people of wisdom across multiple fields the hot button questions and sophisticated questions that we believe there are answers for in Christ's church, but that there is not necessarily access to.
It is our heart that Christ himself would be in our midst as we converse about things we believe he himself is very interested in.
Cool.
So my dear friend, we obviously have been kind of an unintended hiatus since releasing the Vanessa cast. And it actually brings a real sore point of contention up, you know, about why we've had that hiatus. Last time we caught up, we had a beer together, and you did 2 things basically, which just, you know, made me think, can I continue to do a cast with this guy?
Yeah.
1, I bought the churros and you ate the last churro, and 2, I don't know why you're laughing. Like, you know, I'm really upset about this, and you know, we used the loo, like, you know, very closely after each other, and you left the toilet seat up, so I went to take a deuce and I sat down on wet toilet seat, or lack of toilet seat, and I just
Response.
I haven't wanted to actually talk to you up until this point, or do a cast, let alone do a cast with you, because I'm just so upset. That's the reason for the break.
Well, I think that the sophisticated question does have an answer in Christ's church.
This taboo subject.
Yeah, this taboo subject. That last churro was sitting. Bear in mind, people, these churros were about this long, so not like full-size churros. It was a plate of about 7. So it wasn't even an even number. Now, that last one was sitting there for ages.
It's one of the devil's strategies.
It was sitting there for such a long time.
Yeah.
And Jared hadn't even touched it. I can't remember if I actually asked if he wanted it. Obviously, always when you ask, like, anyone would be a dick to say yes, but I can't remember whether I asked or not. As far as the toilet goes, I'm pretty sure I used a urinal, but that's your own fault for not looking before sitting.
Then where was I sitting? What was I sitting on?
I'm not sure, but
what did I do a number 2 in? Like,
I don't know. But I think that these accusations have me. I feel a bit attacked, and I'm hoping that Jacinda's and Labour's hate speech laws come through, so I can charge you under the Hate Speech Act, because I'm feeling very attacked right now.
What I'm hearing is I'm sorry, and what I'm feeling is I forgive you.
I'm sorry that you feel that way.
What were we talking about? Like, what were we talking about before the cast? Like, basically, you know, if you make the other person responsible, then it absolves you of any more responsibility. Yeah, I love that. Like,
yeah.
No. The real reason, ladies and gentlemen, is basically I have been super busy with school. We are in what we call a reporting term, so that's meant I've been very under the pump to just get assessments marked and enter in results so that actually we can have our mid-year reports ready. Caleb has had the great problem, the good problem of having a new job that he started, and there's been an adjustment obviously to our working schedules. So that's the only real reason for the hiatus, and we apologize that we haven't put out more and sooner. We have recorded a couple, but yeah, we just haven't got around to releasing more. But we hope in the next wee while to be releasing some more content, so please stay tuned for that.
And we're sorry if you were upset by our lack of uploading. Well, we're sorry if you feel upset about that. No, but yeah, thanks.
You were supposed to do the YouTuber apology. Yeah, you were supposed to do the YouTuber apology, man.
Yeah, I forgot. I did chuck a sigh or two in there.
I did catch that.
Yeah.
Yeah, are you finding what are you loving about the new job, my friend?
Just like anything, it takes a while to become accustomed, so we'll find out in a bit of time. But yeah,
stay tuned.
Keeping busy, which is good. Yeah.
And how's your little Lottie?
She's good. Lottie is biting a lot, so that's good. We're just.
They just said Lottie, not Joanna.
Yeah. Joanna always has been. That's been a problem with her. But yeah, Lottie's been. She's almost 1 year old in 2 weeks and a couple of days. So that'll be fun. She's recently started walking a little bit. Just absent-mindedly, took like a good 4 or 5 steps whilst watching Sesame Street today. Yeah, she's doing well, and she's got a Tickle Me Elmo coming from her gran that we're probably more excited about than she will be. She loves Elmo, so yeah, and we're all doing well. Just adjusting to me being at work, but yeah, it's a fun time. How are things on your end, bro? With little one, new baby, Annabella?
Good. I was gonna say to that point, like it's magic. You see, like we basically seeing little humans, and like we all start at that stage. We were all that perfect blend of innocence and vulnerability, and yet we all become the adults that we are, right? It's a humbling thing that all humanity starts at that stage, and it's magical because of it. I think, like seeing Lottie, seeing Felicity, seeing Annabella. We've had a hard couple of weeks in the fact that in an otherwise busy term, also the whole family's been sick, so it's been a couple of sick days here and there. Really nasty to hear, like your 4-month-old, coughing really chesty coughs, and Plunkett not being able to do much, because it's like when she's coughing to the point that she's actually sicking up, and some of the breast milk that she's actually been drinking, that's been tough. But yeah, like hard as well when like your significant other is also sick, so she's needing time to recover. It's been tough, but I think we are finally on the mend now. It's been another reason why, like, I haven't. I've been, from my end, slack that we haven't been able to record more. But Caleb is ever the gracious co-host.
Actually, as are you,
master. Yeah, he's actually a bit of a taskmaster, like really cracking the whip and off camera.
Yeah, eating all your churros. Yeah,
threatening to cancel me.
Yeah. You guys have no idea half the stuff I've edited out.
Of yourself.
That didn't need to be added, but I can edit that part out as well. So
I was going to actually say at this point a little bit about actually what motivated for me this topic, right? But which I've talked a little bit about previously. But it's where these arguments were actually first kind of like properly put to me. I must have been about like 19, 20 at the time. This must have been like 10, almost 12 years ago.
Yeah.
that I saw a particular debate that William Lane Craig had with a Kevin Scharp at Notre Dame University. You know, talking about like the existence of God and like, you know, can we really know if God exists or not? And, you know, why is that really important? I forget the exact moot. But the opposition to Craig, who was an atheist himself, did me a really big favor in that he actually summarized Craig's 9 typical arguments that he used for theism. He uses the first 6 to actually summarize, you know, the general argument for theism, and then he uses the remaining 3 to actually specifically support Christian theism. But they all kind of build on each other. And yeah, so as previously mentioned, I write periodically, you know, sporadically in a personal blog. One of my earlier entries was actually articulating these 9 arguments. Thank you, Mr. Kevin Scharp, though, who, even though he doesn't believe these things, did me the big favor of being like, oh yeah, like this is actually a really nice, concise way of putting it, and actually really makes sense of the arguments for theism and Christian theism specifically. Yeah, so I actually thought for our fan base, and just for any general viewer and general watcher, like the way Craig typically articulates these, I mean, I am no scholar, I am no, you know, professional intellectual to that extent, but from my own layman's perspective and my own layman's hopefully accessible presentation, I want to actually give something to our audience that can, you know, give you some good solid arguments for why, particularly any theism makes sense as opposed to atheism, and specifically why Christian theism makes sense in the host of world religions that there are over, say, you know, any general theism. Yeah, it's a bit of a, like I said, a love letter, but in this sense, I want it to be something thoughtful and thought-provoking that actually edifies our audience, how it gives them some touchstones, touch points where they can actually, in a general conversation with someone who's a non-believer, someone who's actually looking at Christian faith, to actually say, well, let's progressively lead them towards a worldview that actually makes sense of the world, more generally speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. On these points, I think, as Jared and I had discussed, we'll be doing, most likely in this first part, we'll be doing those first 6 points that argue for theism as opposed to atheism. And then in the next part, we'll be arguing for, more specifically, for Christian theism. I'm sure we'll touch a little bit on that as we go through it. And, you know, it's hard for us to not at least hint towards it. But yeah, we'll definitely be going through that. And yeah, this seems like a fun one. So, Jared, what is the first argument for Christian theism or for theism in general?
So the first argument that Craig typically presents in his public debates is the Kalam Cosmological Argument. This has been popularized more recently. You know, there's been the odd YouTube video in Christian channels by, you know, Craig's own apologetics organization, reasonablefaith.org. The YouTuber Cosmic Skeptic actually, you know, somewhat famously actually interviewed Craig himself actually on this particular argument. We'll make sure to link that in the description. It's a good discussion, actually. They really tease it out, and it's very respectful for both sides from a, you know, theist and atheist perspective. But this Kalam cosmological argument, summed briefly, it basically is that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Kalam comes from the name of a branch of medieval Islamic scholasticism, and it's a modern variant on the cosmology argument. Cosmology being like a study of the cosmos, of metaphysics and overarching principles that govern said universe, cosmos, chronos. And it was popularized actually by Craig himself, and at least in our more recent times, in his 1979 book by the same name. The argument's key underpinning idea is the metaphysical impossibility of actual infinities and of a temporally past infinite universe. And it's traced by Craig back to the 11th century Persian Muslim scholastic philosopher Al-Ghazali. Now, it's worth mentioning here as well, these first arguments, these first 6 are in advocacy of general theism. So there are some sources when we're talking about general theism where we would echo the idea of St. Augustine, all truth is God's truth. If it's pointing to this objectivity, to this transcendence, we can get to this point of actually common ground where, okay, we can accept common ground, there is a God, there is some God. And just like Caleb said, not 2-3 minutes ago, we will find ourselves inevitably going back to Christ as that known reality. Hebrews 1, the exact representation of the invisible God. But this definitely gives us some sense of common ground. But back to this point, this feature of actual infinities and of a temporally past infinite universe distinguishes it from other cosmological arguments, such as that of Thomas Aquinas, which rests on the impossibility of a causally ordered infinite regress. A little bit more on that in our second argument. And those of Liebnez and Samuel Clark, which refer to the principle of sufficient reason. I'll link something in the description that articulates that a little longer and in more detail. Suffice to say, this argument, as Craig often articulates, as it comes down to 6 points. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. The universe has a cause, and if the universe has a cause, then an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who, without the universe, is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. While those characteristics, well, to make the universe to this degree of sophistication and detail, he would need to be all those attributes. And so the 6th point, therefore, an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who without the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. Hope that follows so far. Anything you want to jump in and say at this point, Caleb?
Nothing so far. Yeah.
Something I would say here, so talking about cause and effect and causal relationships, this links back to our second argument, which we'll get onto soon, which is contingency. But we understand cause and effect. We understand this idea that if I throw a rock at the window, the effect is the glass smashing. The cause is the rock going through it. We don't say that actually either of those exist independent of each other in terms of the actual thing that happens. Like, it wouldn't make sense for the glass to just be smashed in and of its own accord without some explanation of said cause. It might be a cause we don't know and we're not actually cognizant of, but it doesn't make sense that actually the glass would smash in and of itself, right? So my point being, effects, we know this logically, effects are not self-originating. So we talk in terms of the universe, even though this is a small scale analogy, this is a transcendent, objective, truth idea, properly basic belief. It applies to actually how we do cosmology and how we make sense of the universe generally. First cause, progenitor, there has to be the sense of actually, well, where did the universe come from? There had to be something in which actually this originated from. Naturalists put this down to say something like the Big Bang. Theists would actually say maybe it was God or gods that actually brought everything into being by a variety of resources. Sometimes there's a blending of the two that actually, maybe the theist believes in the Big Bang being the means to which actually God created said universe. And a belief that actually I don't have a problem with myself. Trouble with that, though, is if we don't have a first cause, we essentially have an infinite regression. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly, about what that means. Naturalism can't reconcile this. It needs transcendence. Naturalism needs to actually reconcile actually where does this universe come from? Because if the means to which actually the universe begins to exist, we have the Thomas Aquinas problem, where actually it's a causally ordered infinite regress. Basically, within this closed system that is the universe, there is nothing intervening from outside said universe to bring everything into being. And so, yeah, this is basically where we actually see that actually there needs to be that point of intervention. There needs to be that first cause. There needs to be an explanation of that first cause. We see this in the idea of, with a creator, this makes sense because we can actually say this creator can be causeless in nature. In the closed system argument, where actually things are actually closed in and unto themselves, there can't be something within, say, that window, going back to my analogy, that can cause it to break in of itself loose, but I think you get the point that I'm trying to make there. What's different with a creator? The atheist, the naturalist might say it's like, well, where did the creator come from? If he's outside the universe, where did the actually creator come from in the first place? But a creator can actually be causeless in nature if we accept that theistically. The idea that his creation is ex nihilo, which means in Latin out of nothing, that is an attestation to glory. And it's what Craig was going back to when he mentions that this creator would necessarily need to be beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful, into which to actually bring about such a universe. I would attest to something C.S. Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity, which he calls the numinous awe. It's the sense of eternity in our hearts. Staying with me for a second, I want you to consider that actually this idea that actually for what is forever. Some of us have actually sat around sometimes and we've actually maybe started thinking like, well, how long is infinity, or how long does forever go on for? We think about, say, in a heavenly reality, for example, where, we will be with God for eternity. Those who are Christians, or even non-Christians, you might consider this idea. And the more we begin to think about, like, well, 10 years is a long time, and 50 years is a much longer time, and 100 years, I can't even comprehend that. 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 1,000,000 years, it begins to boggle the imagination. And so then we think of a concept like forever, we can't fully comprehend it. But on another note, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's related. I would posit that actually the possibility of even conceiving of forever, the possibility of even beginning to think or understand what is forever, that wouldn't be possible if there was some kind of appeal to transcendence. The awareness of eternity, this is this numinous awe that actually C.S. Lewis talks about, or in Ecclesiastes, it talks about the eternity in the hearts of man. It's a further example of this appeal to transcendence beyond ourselves within the human experience. Talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument another way, when I was younger, I was part of a youth group committee, and I remember presenting a study where I was talking about intelligent design, and I talked about the example of a robot and design. And I made the example basically, moral law. The creator who designed said robot would say, don't let the robot go into water, because obviously that's not beneficial for the robot. But if you could create such an AI robot that actually had free will, and it was saying, I want to go into water, that was a terrible robot. Edit that out, Caleb. He's going to leave that in.
I'll put it in several times.
The robot goes in to said water. The creator knows from the blueprint it's actually not beneficial for said robot to go into water. So there's a love relationship in towards actually what is design. You've got a God theistically actually saying, don't do this, it has this effect, and this is the cause. But we see actually there's inverse reasoning there talking about actually cause and effect, right? And we talk about actually the robot, which is impressive, significantly complex. I mean, I can't, even begin to claim to understand how robotics works or coding works, or actually how you can get all that input data and to actually speak that language so that a robot can do all the things that it does, even a simple robot. And so we would infer that actually looking at a robot as complex as it is, it would need a sufficiently sophisticated, complex mind outside said robot to be able to create something as complex as that. Exponentially more sophisticated to actually create something as a product that is as complex as that. And I would say the inverse reasoning is true as well. Like we actually see, well, if we look at humanity, all of the human potential that there is, all of the complexity that Caleb is and how he thinks and how he articulates things, on a philosophical level, on a spiritual level, on a mind, body, soul level, on a cellular level. Like there is so much complexity going on in our bodies right now at this moment that we can't make proper comprehension of, and we just take for granted, right? Similar reasoning would actually suggest that actually cause and effect, there must be something sufficiently and exponentially more complex than us to make something as complex as us. And the same could be said of the creation itself. We look at the creation in all its complexity. We look at the effect that is the world around us, the solar system around us, the galaxy around us, the universe around us. And just a small study into the scale of cosmology absolutely dwarfs you, humbles you. I don't know if Caleb, you've seen any of the Louis Giglio stuff on actually stars and actually, like mind-boggling, right?
Yeah, and I often tend to, in terms of what tends to blow my mind along similar lines, when one looks into the probability of life existing on Earth in the conditions that scientifically apparently it appears to be created life, not happened. If it did, the probability of it happening is just so unlikely that it's ridiculous when mathematicians and statisticians, I can't remember the word, when those whose field is statistics have taken in all of the variables of the conditions of our atmosphere, our placement within our solar system, just the things that happened that brought about life on this earth. It's just so ridiculously unlikely. And then the fact that life, be it through creation or evolution, became something that was sentient, and sentient as humans, is mind-boggling. And some people that have done some really thorough and interesting looks into that, the likes of John Lennox and Richard Swinburne, who both scholars at Oxford, and they do some brilliant work about that.
No, like I think that's an important point to make. I want to talk about that a little bit more as we go on to the a little bit on the mathematics argument and in the fine-tuning argument, but I think that's so it. I think you need within any worldview to be able to make sense of these lived realities, and we want to give total grace and understanding to the people who actually accept and believe a different worldview. Like that is the right of any human being to believe as they wish, to make sense of reality in a coherent way, right? I remember something actually a lecturer said when I took an epistemology class and back in my time at Laidlaw, was that on some level, people living from different worldviews that aren't Christians, that is actually giving credit to the fact that their worldview is livable, that their worldview must cohere to some transcendent facts and some subjective facts about the reality, objectivity and subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
And so it is the point of the evangelist, then the Christian, to actually say, well, one, defensive apologetics, how does our own belief system make sense of lived realities, make sense of the world as it is? And offensive apologetics, how do we graciously, lovingly provoke thought around actually how other worldviews do not make sense and do not actually match up with what is lived reality?
Yeah.
I think the point of actually the scale of the universe, the cosmic, seeming infinitesimality of which actually things should not be, like the cosmic shades where actually it's a fraction of an inch this way, that way, definitely attests to the idea that actually, well, this seems to be designed, but I'll speak to that soon. But totally agree with your point, my friend.
Yeah.
All this to say, this first argument that actually everything that begins to exist must have a cause. In closing on that, it's important to say that actually, if we look at something that has sufficient complexity, there must be exponentially more complexity to explain said system, to actually cause that. If we're talking about sentience and design and the process, getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it follows that this first argument, everything that begins to exist must have a cause, and that same truth statement applies to actually the first cause and the beginnings of this universe. Which brings us to our next point, our next argument, which is contingency. And contingency is, as Craig would summarize it, states that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. To quote here, in philosophy and logic, contingency is the status of propositions that are neither true under every possible valuation, what we call tautologies, or false under every possible valuation, i.e. contradictions. A contingent proposition is neither necessarily true nor necessarily false. Propositions that are contingent may be so because they contain logical connectives, which, along with the truth value of any of its atomic parts, that means isolated by themselves, are true on the value of their own merits, atomic parts, determine the truth value of the proposition. This is to say that the truth value of the proposition is contingent upon the truth values of the sentences which comprise it. Contingent propositions depend on the facts, whereas analytical propositions are true without regard to any facts about which they speak. Does that follow, my friend?
Yeah. That's that's following so far.
I have a further definition for actually these keywords here: tautological contradictions and possible propositions.
Yeah.
So tautological propositions, which must be true no matter what the circumstances are or could be. So an example is, it is the case that the sky is blue, or it is not the case that the sky is blue. A contradiction, we kind of understand what that is. It's which must necessarily be untrue no matter what the circumstances are or could be. Example, it's raining and it's not raining. Both can't be true. Truth by nature is mutually exclusive. They can't both be true at the same time. Possible propositions which are true or could have been true given the circumstances. So examples are x plus y equals 4. There are only 3 planets. There are more than 3 planets. All are necessarily true propositions, and all are contingent propositions, and or are also possible propositions. A good one to personalize it is often like skeptics like to point out with the resurrection of Jesus, we're getting well ahead of ourselves here, but it demonstrates what I'm talking about. There were, I think they mentioned out there were, say, 2 angels that were sighted at the grave when actually the disciples went to actually go and see the tomb of Jesus after he was resurrected. And different gospel accounts say there was only 1 angel. And Craig actually mentions this example himself, actually. Skeptics often citing this and saying, well, the gospels are inconsistent. One gospel says there was 1 angel and another gospel says there was 2 angels. They can't, they're clearly contradicting each other. It's like, and Craig says, well, no, this seems to be an instance of possible propositions, because they're not necessarily contingent on one another. There actually could be an instance where, based on eyewitness testimony, one witness saw one thing and another witness saw another thing.
Yeah.
They could both simultaneously be true. They don't necessarily invalidate each other.
The other argument that I've heard to back that one up, there are several, but one that I found is quite apt is one that I think William Lane Craig may have used, but I also heard Frank Turek use this argument, and that is when the Titanic sunk, some people claimed that they saw it split in half and then sink, and then some say that it just sunk as a whole. When they found it, they found that it was together, correct? Yeah, I think it was either way. But the truth was the Titanic sunk. That didn't invalidate the story of the eyewitnesses that the Titanic had sunk. They just remembered some slight details differently, especially since they were caught up with something they just weren't expected to be experiencing, such as an empty tomb of their friend who they had seen die a gruesome death, their dear friend and beloved master. They had seen him on a cross. They had seen his life end. And then they saw something as miraculous as an angelic presence telling them that he had risen. Now, hey, maybe one of those angels was behind a rock from the perspective of one of the other disciples, but either way, the tomb was empty, is the argument that's being made. Not the small. But one thing that I would argue is, not necessarily I would argue, but I guess just as a devil's advocate,
gloves up, man.
Point that I'll bring to you is this contingency point. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. It doesn't seem that God or the Trinity tend to have a simply accessible or a good explanation for his or its existence. How would these 9 arguments or this the contingency argument combat that?
Yeah, great question. So this is what I was kind of hinting at before with the whole if we accept the Kalam argument first, and this is where actually these arguments actually do sequentially build on each other.
Yeah.
This first cause, being an uncaused creator, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful. This makes sense of said reality. But let me explain this as it links to contingency, right? So firstly, like, for example, multiple universes, right? Both naturalists and theists alike have tried to make sense of actually our lived reality, to say, well, perhaps actually we live in multiple universes to make sense of this first cause, this cosmological argument, because astrophysicists, cosmologists, philosophers have found this is a really hard argument to get around, in terms of first cause in closed systems, right? So the popular theory has been proposed of multiple universes, right, in which you could have a God being the first cause of some universes, and in other universes they might not require the existence of a God as a first cause. But Craig would advance this idea that actually having a God as a first cause is what we call a properly basic belief, in that actually it doesn't make sense logically that actually some universes would require a God to exist and other universes would not. Like, and it's kind of like I would argue it's an intellectual sleight of hand. It's like, well, if I don't want to believe in God, like I could just say multiple universes other way around it. We just exist in a universe that doesn't actually need a God. If it's accepted to be that actually this is a properly basic belief, that actually it either is or isn't, and the fact that we exist, this lends credence to the belief that actually is a properly basic belief, all possible universes would require a God to exist. So, yeah, it's a transcendent cause must be transcendent of all possible realities. Otherwise, it isn't transcendent. That's how I would argue that first point. And so therefore there's a fundamentality of that truth. But I mentioned before actually this idea of a infinite regression. If we look, say, for example, with the naturalist example, that actually, okay, there was, before the Big Bang, there was pre-material, there was, stuff that existed before the Big Bang to actually bring all the universe into being. It's like, okay, we'll accept that. Where did that stuff come from? Oh, there was stuff that actually put it there, maybe outside of this universe, another universe that interacted with their own. Maybe there's some kind of cosmic universal generator. Oh, okay, where did that come from? Well, maybe there was a pre-existing universe or subset of universes that actually made that, cosmic universal generator. Okay, where did that come from? You see the point I'm trying to make here. The burden of proof is on the naturalist in that point. It's not the theist to actually explain that. If they bring the point, they actually have to reason, where does that come from? Like, where does that pre-existing material, if it is a closed system, actually come from to actually bring everything to be in the first place? It's not just the atheist or the naturalist doesn't get off the hook there. They need to be able to make sense of that lived reality as well. They need to be able to make sense of the universe in that as well.
Yeah.
Does that follow so far?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I remember coming across an argument from, I think it was from Stephen Hawking, as to, have you seen that one, as to why the universe exists?
Yeah. No, go on. Yeah.
That the universe, so he's accepting that a cause, the effect of the universe coming into existence needed a cause, and his cause is that the universe needed to exist, and therefore the universe created itself. And a lot of academics hold to this belief, which is perplexing to me because it's quite circular reasoning. Don't need much explanation to see why it's circular.
Well, the interesting thing is, like, semantically, that's not far from faith. And I know, like, some people would have a problem with me making that syllogism, but it's, I would say, like, you're basically making a belief statement. You're not making a scientific statement at that point. You're actually saying, I believe this based on the evidence. It's like, that's fine. I believe this based on the evidence. And I think logically it makes sense to believe this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, if we take, for example, like, talking about properly basic beliefs, I want to come back to that point of infinite regression. The current body of scientific knowledge often refers to certain propositions as either laws or theories, relying on logical connectives, relying on contingency to create the matrix that is that body of knowledge. Laws of science can be understood as what Craig refers to as these properly basic beliefs. These beliefs are still fundamental to the entire body of knowledge to work and exist, such as the laws of thermodynamics or the principles of life and entropy. I wanted to mention that because I'll bring up those examples a little bit later. Now, within our current, existing knowledge, these theories make sense. Atomic theory, for example, has previously made sense, and the whole stuff they're finding out about quantum theory, about bosons and quark particles, is entirely blowing up what was their perceived understanding of atomic theory. But it doesn't automatically undermine the whole system, right? And I think that's the strength of contingency, that there's logical connectives, that there's causal relationships between truth. We take one thing that's isolated, but it's really that it is just isolated, isn't it? Often one truth that we can accept, yep, I believe that that's true, links up with other truths, kind of like an atom, you remember those old atomic models that you made at school in chemistry? Here's the hydrogen particle linking with oxygen, and it's that. I see it as that kind of picture, right? Truth links up with other truth. So going to then the point actually about an infinite regression, and your point about Stephen Hawking making that the universe must have created itself, and how you'd need to believe that as a faith statement, I'd actually argue it's more logical to believe that it's a creator. See, creator avoids an infinite regression, because actually with the creator in timeless past creating the universe, creating time, it actually gives us a point of reference. Because the trouble with actually believing in a pre-existing material actually creating the universe, it itself being part of said universe, it itself being part of that closed system, there is no point of reference. Why are we where we are right now? Why are we not millions of years into the future? Why are we not millions of years into the past? That is the nature of infinity, right? The closed system means that actually we are within that infinite series. There is no point of reference. Whereas with the creator, as a properly basic belief, there is a point of reference. There is a point where time began. We could argue over here about actually, in a whole nother podcast, is it was millions of years? Was it 10,000 years? That's a subject for another time. But point being, theism reconciles this to say, actually, we have that point of reference. Things began, and actually we have some sense of equilibrium in terms of where we are, who we are right now, present day. And that is another reason why actually the contingency point makes sense. In answer to your question as well that you advanced.
Yeah.
And I think that makes sense of actually the contingency argument, right? That we understand that truth connects with other truths. Truth connects with other truths. A system of truth cannot be easily dissected. It's why actually in evangelism, where you're essentially inviting someone to deconstruct the worldview, it's why actually one good point doesn't immediately make them think, oh, well, I'm totally undone and I totally don't believe what I believe anymore, right? No, worldviews cohere, they make sense of lived reality. Actually, a system of truth cannot be easily dissected. And we see these cause and effect relationships. I like the idea that chaos theory and the butterfly effect kind of popularized this, right? But a worldview that actually has to have a system of belief that is contingent. We don't live in a world or have worldviews that are detached or atomic. A worldview needs to be believable. It needs to cohere with subjectivity and objectivity. Talking about distinction on this point from the created universe, and this is talking about the necessity of that said cause being distinct from the universe, so therefore not pantheism, not panentheism. Distinction from the created universe actually avoids logical inconsistencies. Most schools of theism would also reason that a god has to be entirely distinct and separate to the created, something of what the concept of holiness and separateness and otherness seeks to convey. It's not exclusively that, but it is that as well, right? If this creator is part of his creation, we run into similar issues of regression that were briefly described above, and hit a similar obstacle naturalists have with the Big Bang and pre-existing matter. This said, if such concessions are made about God, or a God's nature, it begins to make sense of the other consecutive issues and reasons for a general and specific worldview of theism. Further, if this is conceded, it logically connects with the ideas that associate with transcendence, meaning, purpose, absolute realities, existence as something other than just matter, and the consequent idea of that existence as being grounded in the realities of something more substantial and beyond just what we see and perceive empirically. I love two passages to mention here. One is John chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. Might actually see if I can actually just link this up briefly. Which is actually Jesus introduced as the Word, or as the Greek translates it, the Logos. Let me get this up for you. Maybe if you could do me a favor, Caleb, and actually get up for me Proverbs 8, verse 20 to 20. Sorry, Proverbs 8, verse 20 to 32. Proverbs 8, verse 20 to 32. In this passage, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Nothing, without him, nothing was made that has been made. We get a sense that actually this distinction from the creation and this personhood of the Word, we actually see that everything gets its bearing, its meaning, its purpose from this abstraction.
Yeah.
I've heard actually Jordan Peterson talk about this personhood. Actually, the Logos in Greek is this idea of the order of things, the voice that gives form, the actual, that takes the creative potential in chaos, things without form, things without actual semblance of order or design. The Logos is what speaks into that chaos and gives it shape and gives it form and gives it meaning and gives it coherence and unity.
Yeah.
So we actually see that actually, again, a creator bringing sense of that actual primordial chaos, this worldview of Jesus as that Logos, as the Greek worldview would have actually positioned it and put it, is an appeal to, again, Augustine's idea of all truth being God's truth. The Greeks had an understanding, the Romans had an understanding, but it's only in Christ that we actually get a worldview that actually properly coheres and makes sense of reality. As we go in throughout the rest of John, about John 1 verse 17, it actually talks about that the Word was made flesh, and we understand, so this Word was Jesus. This unknowable God was made known to us in the person of Christ.
And I'll bring up that Proverbs 8, 22 to 32, was it?
To 32, yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
This was a passage I actually wrote on as part of a university paper I did about 2 years ago, looking at exegesis. Here we actually have the personification of wisdom, who is basically saying at the start of the passage, chapter 8, please listen to wisdom. The whole book of Proverbs is talking about this idea of actually wisdom is understanding the chokmah of the universe. And chokmah being the idea of there is a nature of how things are created and ordered, wherein actually things are meant to be and they work together and they cohere when they're actually, everything works in this kind of shalom unity. I remember Tim Mackey of the Bible Project putting it a little bit like there's a master craftsman and he's planing a piece of wood, and he doesn't work against the grain, he works with the grain when he's trying to shape something and make something into what it is. So wisdom then, chokmah, is this idea that actually when we work with the grain of the universe, there is actually an order to things that actually benefits us to go with, benefits us to live with. And this applies to meaning and purpose and morality. It's a very amplified concept within the Hebrew worldview. And wisdom as chokmah is personified in this passage as being this woman by the city gate saying, listen to me, don't ignore me, attend to my cries. Do you want to learn about how things really are? You want to understand what the world and how it really is? Listen to my voice. Some people have tried to say Christologically, maybe this wisdom personification is supposed to be Jesus. For different reasons, I don't think that's necessarily the case or even necessary. But the point still remains that actually we get this idea from these verses of from the creation, 22, 23, wisdom being present at the very earliest stages of the universe, being involved in the Genesis creation, being involved in the order and the design and the sophistication of things and how they came together. 24, 25, getting ideas from the very first days of creation and the cosmological account that Genesis presents. 26, 27, the heavens and the earth, very Genesis imagery, the Babylonian creation myth, bearing some parallels to this account as well, to what actually Genesis gives as well. 28, 29, there's this idea actually God is ordering things. He's setting limits to things. He's putting rules in place which actually govern things. And 30, that beautiful idea of actually God being the master workman. You almost get this kind of father-son, daddy-daughter imagery where actually the personification of wisdom is present with God, actually seeing how he orders things and he creates things. All this to say that actually the contingency example being design is an example of this kind of contingency. We look at the Fibonacci sequence in or the golden ratio in nature, and plants are in the way the ocean waves crest, or in the way that actually our galaxies spiral, or we look at, say, the complexity of cells and irreducible complexity. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but contingency would actually link up with this idea that actually truth connects. If we see actually in some of these places, oh, I accept this to be true, it would then stand to reason that this actually means that this is true, and perhaps this is true, and perhaps this is true. So we're seeing that with these developing arguments. The first argument, you can click out of that at this point, my friend.
Cool.
We see that with the first argument being that actually everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Contingency, anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. We see that actually the truth, being that logos, the personification of this logos, makes order of this unknown and this formless chaos in a way that actually, if the universe just created itself, logically that's not sufficient enough, I think, to me. Logically, that doesn't make sense or isn't as intellectually compelling or satisfying as actually saying there's a person behind this, and there's a person that created with purpose.
Cool. And I think moving on from there, this next point answers a little bit my further than what you were asking earlier, my challenge of on the contingency argument, anything that exists, does God exist? Is there the possibility of something as large as a creator, something? So we've gone over why it is needed for there to be a creator, why the cause is there. There has to be a cause for our universe being in place and happening and life happening. But is that even possible, that there is something beyond what we can understand? Is it possible that there is a creator?
Yeah, I think I know we're jumping around a little bit, but permission from my lovely host, and apologies to our guests. When we go into our second part, I want to talk about specifically the historical claims for the resurrection. See, William Lane Craig actually did his doctoral thesis on the historicity of the resurrection, and basically, can the historical claims about whether actually Christ lived, died and actually came back to life, was resurrected, can that be verified and verified to be true? Without getting too ahead of ourselves, like I would say, yes, they can be. And contingency
Spoilers.
at that point, spoilers. Contingency at that point actually would say, okay, well, we have to do something with that. Well, one, people don't normally come back to life, not to my knowledge, and that would lead us to believe it's like, okay, there's something significant about this, so let's take notice of this. There's a contingency to this. Okay, well, what was the kind of person that Jesus was? What kind of things did he, do and say and believe? What did he say of himself? What did he believe of himself?
Yeah.
Being of a particular worldview, being a particular kind of person, being a particular worker of miracles as he was, and actually this being attested to, there is contingency to that, which cannot be ignored. All this to say that actually, can this God even be known? Big questions, important questions. But we also ought to looking at where the evidence goes, if we can accept some things to be true, contingently, that it would actually say, well, okay, that then links with other truths. If we jump right ahead and we're actually saying the resurrection actually did happen, so okay, maybe the stuff that Jesus was saying about Genesis and by quoting Genesis actually is true. Okay, so if the things that were actually said in Genesis are actually true, then that means that's actually making mutually exclusive truth claims about all of the creation and things as they really are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you get my train of thought and actually going with that.
Yeah, no, I've always loved that argument. I've tended to stick to that, and for those of you out there who are budding apologists and wanting to get into these discussions and debates, that is something that I'm sure Jared can attest to, and that I definitely give as a piece of advice: stick to one issue as best you can within a discussion. Don't let people derail you to other arguments before you have finished one point. I know that that's something I struggle with, and I do far too often on my own without someone else trying to distract me from the point I'm making. But that's just the way my ADHD brain goes.
Oh, I heard a great piece of advice once about actually, theirs is the burden of proof. That actually, if they ask the question, you actually ought to start by saying, well, what do you believe? Don't actually feel like you need to wear the burden of proof. Actually saying, if they're posing a question, it's like, okay, you're asking the question, what is your answer to that question? How do you make sense? One, because actually, they have the burden of proof if if they're asking the question, you don't actually have to wear that. They actually have to say, well, I have the proof actually why this is true, and I can convince you of that point. Yeah. Two, it actually, tactically, it actually gives you time to think about, well, what actually is my answer to that question? Yeah. I found that very helpful in the past too.
Yeah. Cool. Now, what is our next argument?
So this is looking at the ontological argument. Just actually look up our definition of ontology again, because I want to make sure that I actually do a good job of explaining it.
Yeah.
Ontology is the branch of philosophy that studies concepts such as existence, being, becoming, and reality. It includes questions of how entities are grouped into basic categories and which of these entities exist on the most fundamental level. Ontology is sometimes referred to as the science of being and belongs to the major branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. I love that actually scientists, in our 20th century and 21st century now actually study, naturalists, atheistic scientists, study this realm of science called metaphysics, which is making sense of the cosmology of things and the grander sense of purpose and why things are. But as it links to this discussion, as it links to actually Craig's arguments, ontology suggests that it is possible that a maximally great being exists. coming back to what I said previously, Craig advances this idea that actually this creator be causing everything to exist, and the universe existing, having the explanation of its existence, he would need to be this set of characteristics. He would need to be beginningless and changeless, immaterial and timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful. If we're to make sense of the sufficient complexity, if we're to make sense of the power and the scale of the universe as it is, this God would need to be enormously powerful.
Yeah.
This is where we're getting into the realm of what in theology we call the omnis, this idea of omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, each of those being all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere present. And this idea that actually, if we're to make sense of reality as it is, then this God would need to be such things to be sufficiently called God. Personalizing this a little bit, I speak to this in the blog, which I wrote about. Talking about a maximally great being, the thing that often drives right at the heart of this argument is the problem of pain, as C.S. Lewis would call it, as he wrote about in his book of the same name. A big stumbling block to people wanting to believe in a God, and specifically the Christian God, is actually this idea that how can God exist if there is so much pain, so much suffering, which he seemingly wills, which he seemingly allows. In my blog, I talked about basically there's this Greek philosopher named Epicurius, where he basically advanced this famous little epithet, this series of quotes about actually the nature of God and the nature of evil. And he puts it down to say actually a series of quotes. Just have it here. So a bit of context and a bit of a caveat first. I have nothing but sympathy for actually people who actually have this issue with theism, because it's something that in my own testimony I had to work through and actually make sense of.
Yeah.
Examining each of these points that Epicurius actually suggests, I really think that not just general theism, but Christian theism best makes sense of these series of arguments. And Epicurus's points are good enough that I actually think they're worth examining one by one, as it links to this idea of ontology, as it links to this idea of it is possible that a maximally great being exists.
Yeah.
In summary, I'll say the quote first, and then I'll actually go through line by line. So Epicurus's quote: "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" So talking to that first one, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. So it's interesting in the debate between William Lane Craig and Kevin Scharp, the whole thing that actually, for me, motivated this blog and now this podcast, we're talking about it, is that Kevin Scharp mentions this idea of divine psychology. He uses it as a skeptic to say, how can we infer what a God could possibly be thinking or possibly be doing? It's not our place to know, right? But I think divine psychology both explains and doesn't explain God's reasons. Let me unpack that a little bit. So I think an idea of constrained will, as defined to me in my readings by a William P. Young in his controversial book, The Shack, actually explains the human interface of, is God willing to prevent evil but not able, then he is not omnipotent. See, William P. Young reasons in a context of nature and nurture, preconditioning, culture, religion, worldview, politics, biochemistry, ideologies, gender, race, identity, intellect, and relative exposure to all of these things. He poses the question, what is free will really? Does anyone really have absolute free will to do whatever they want? Not to my knowledge. I certainly don't. I am predisposed towards a whole series of choices because of my set of experiences. Or perhaps you could call it my standpoint epistemology. Here's looking at you, James Andrew Harris. On the theistic side, this actually could be explored looking at through the lens of Molinism, which actually I did ask if Caleb could actually explore, define a little bit. But I'll mention these points and then ask him to come back to that if that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah. See, free will of man as Imago Dei explains partly how God can be all-powerful and actually that pain still happens. Imago Dei means the idea that man is the image of God. We reflect God in our capacity for great good and great evil to be willed in others, and especially in our ability to infer some of those causal relationships of our good and evil. Like, it's not like we actually are unaware of the effects of our actions, both good and evil. That would lead us to believe some kind of intentionality, some kind of sentience, some kind of actual understanding of transcendence beyond ourselves. It's another appeal to this idea of image of God and therefore God being said creator. See, sovereignty in conjunction with those omnis doesn't mean, as I understand it, a refutation of those faculties. It's like the whole biggest rock, immovable object, right? An unstoppable force meets an immovable object. We hear the argument that's like, could God create a rock so big that even he can't lift it? You mentioned a point recently. It's actually that's proven true. Like, what was your example? Jesus and the.
Yeah, so he created a rock so big that that he could lift it, and that was. Oh no, that he couldn't. I can't even remember. It was covered by a YouTube channel called Red Pen Logic, and it's a fresh approach to this question. It's typically this question is often typically answered by a lot of logic and good philosophical argument, but not to say that this argument isn't, but it's just more of a fun answer. I can't even remember it off the top of my head, but we'll link that one in the description for you guys.
If I recall, you mentioned how Jesus being in the tomb could not have moved the rock that was put in place of the tomb, and yet with the resurrection he did, so he clearly could move an object.
So it's along those lines. So we'll link that one in for a bit of a fun one.
So like looking at it another way, the sovereignty in conjunction with the omnis doesn't mean a refutation of those faculties. The suspension of those abilities could actually serve a purpose we don't know. So like an example that a lot of theologians might immediately jump to is Jesus and the kenotic Christ idea, as mentioned in Philippians 2 verse 5 to 8. God being aware of the matrix of possibilities he wills and wills not. I'll just actually share this screen briefly. So in this idea, we actually see Philippians 2 verse 5-8. This was a very early Christian creed in the church, dated maybe even within, say, 2 to 5 years after the resurrection, is thought to be actually the historicity of this creed. I might be mixing my sources a little bit, but I'll happily clarify that if that's the case later on. But these verses actually ascribe basically in this beautiful early hymn sung in the church, Jesus, who was in the form of God, did not account equality with God to be a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. This self-emptying that is talked about, this kenosis, is in the Greek, is often referred to as the self-emptying of Christ, this suspension of Christ in his divinity and his humanity simultaneously, seemingly allowed himself to not have full command of the faculties he otherwise had as God.
Yeah.
He wasn't able to do all the things, or seemingly not able to do all the things that he otherwise was able to do. And so to this point on ontology, this could be an example of Christ did this to as our intercessor with the capital I, fully understand what our needs are and aren't, fully understand what it is with perfect empathy, what it is to be human. As the grand high priest, as the book of Hebrews talks about, fully identify with humanity, while still being God simultaneously. And that serves an atonement purpose as well. But talking about ontology and talking about the suspension of will and what is God's will in this, I asked if my dear friend Caleb could talk to Molinism briefly on this point.
Yeah, sure. I don't have a firm and thorough understanding of Molinism, but what I have learned about it in the past, I have come to understand it as quite a coherent approach to the understanding of how God's will and predestination work alongside with humans' free will and lack of or existence of our free will. Molinism is often used as a somewhat middle ground between Calvinism and Arminianism in terms of a view of God's predestination of salvation. And a lot of people I find who claim to be in the Arminian camp, a lot of their views end up being something along the lines of Molinism. But for the definition of Molinism itself, I'll refer to the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. Molinism is a view of the relation between God's grace and human free will, emanating from the emanating from the Spanish Jesuit, the theologian Luis de Molina. Molina asserted that God has a special kind of foreknowledge of human free acts, which are the basis of God's gracious gift of salvation. Molinism was widely adopted by Jesuits and opposed by Dominicans after examination by a special congregation of Rome. Both views were allowed in Catholic schools. So Molinism has three, as we can see here. God has three kinds of knowledge: natural knowledge, middle, and free. And William Lane Craig actually goes through these quite well in his book, The Only Wise God, which I'll bring up here. He has this table here of three types: natural, middle, and free knowledge. Natural knowledge is God's knowledge of all possible worlds. The content of this knowledge is essential to God. Middle knowledge, God's knowledge of what every possible free creature would do under any possible set of circumstances, and hence knowledge of those possible worlds which God can make actual. The content of this knowledge is not essential to God. God's free decision to create a world. Free knowledge, God's knowledge of the actual world. The content of this knowledge is not essential to God. So, as described here, the three logical moments in God's knowledge are summarized in this table. It is important to emphasize again that temporarily there are no such successive moments in God's knowledge. His decision to create the world is an eternal decision. There never was a time when God had middle knowledge but lacked free knowledge. Now, there are a few different examples, two main ones as brought up here. We'll go to that shortly. One of them is in 1 Samuel chapter 23, 6 to 13, which is the story of David at Keilah. And, Keilah. It's translated differently in different translations, but God told David that if he were to remain where he was, that Saul would come get him. And if Saul did get him, that he would be handed over to Saul. So it shows that God is saying something that will happen. However, David leaves, but it doesn't come to place. So it shows that that God's saying that this will happen may be false, but it's not necessarily that it's false. It's that through God's middle knowledge, he said, if you remain here, it was predicated on the idea that if David were to stay in place, then he knew what would happen. Another example is in Matthew chapter 11. And I'll just read that to you guys. So we have an example from Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 11, verses 20 to 24. Then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethesda! Also woe to you, Bethesda, for making buggy games. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. Now, and then he carries on to say, and you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Now, this is a brilliant example of God's middle knowledge and his knowledge predicated on different decisions and different happenings made. Jesus is putting forward if these works had been done in Tyre and Sidon, these people would have repented. Jesus is saying that if this had happened, he knows how things would have turned out. So this is showing God knows all possible outcomes. And one last, there's a, if I'm not doing a very good job at explaining this, I will put forward one more explanation from
an excellent job.
From an Oxford Handbook, many truths of which God is aware. For example, Libby will freely watch a baseball game on TV tomorrow. These ideas are neither necessary nor beyond God's power to control. There are many possible worlds in which Libby does not freely watch a baseball game tomorrow, and there are many ways in which God could have prevented her doing so, mostly radically, by deciding never to create Libby at all. Contingent truths, as we were mentioning earlier, of this sort, then, are only true because God freely allowed them to be true. Such propositions, said Molina, elements of God's free knowledge, and this obviously is where foreknowledge of the contingent events that occur in our world belongs. This Oxford Handbook definition and essay on Molinism goes on to explain natural knowledge and middle knowledge further. But yeah, these are good explanations as to how Molinism interacts, and I think explains quite succinctly God's interaction with creation in regards to allowing for evil or not. But yeah, we'll link a lot of that in the description for you guys, if you want to research that further.
Yeah, I there's a cascading series of arguments I want to build addressing each of Epicurus's points, but I think the Molinism one is an interesting one to bring into the discussion of ontology and around the discussion of pain. I always wonder if actually Moses's intercessory prayer for the Israelites on the top of Sinai when they're worshipping the golden calf is an example of God's middle knowledge, because God actually says in his anger, I am going to destroy the Israelites and I'm going to make a nation out of you. So still keeping my promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob and to Isaac. And, I will make a nation out of you, Moses. And Moses intercedes for the Israelite people and says, do not do this for a list of reasons. And God relents. God doesn't actually do what he said he was otherwise intending to do. Which always makes me think, it's like, it's a great example of like, wow, when you're praying to God outside of human existence, outside of, time, as it were, our prayers, the prayer of Christians, has a real possibility of affecting like really lasting dramatic change. Like, it's quite a humbling prospect. But I digress. I think like this is why, in terms of ontology, in terms of human sovereignty and volition and imaging God in that sense, I think this is why the ancient tale of Adam and Eve and resulting original sin is so eloquent and simple, yet profound in articulating the human condition. Adam and Eve were presented with the opportunity to sin, and they did. In their eyes being opened, they realized the relational dynamic of sin that all of us know only too well. Disobedience and disregard for the will of others has consequences, but is something we can do in the exercising of volition. This line of reasoning accounts for most instances of evil we commit against one another, albeit not exhaustively, as God strikes the balance with all peoples everywhere between what we could call total depravity, which is the bent of our wills to do whatever we want with no regard for God, although sometimes unintentionally aligning with his will and purposes, and absolute depravity, which is the worst it could possibly be, our wills always desiring what is morally bad, given what is available to us. The God of the Christian worldview would desire all people to relate to him, that he might define right and wrong for and with them, and in trust and faith that they seek after that ideal, that definition of right and wrong, to realize it in their own lives. So then, speaking to this first point of Epicurus, is God willing to prevent evil but not able, then he is not omnipotent. I think, at least theologically, this explains some of the reasoning actually why good wouldn't. There's this idea of actually what is the image of God and who is man, and actually why God sometimes suspends some of these choices. But stick with us a little longer as we address some of these points, because I think there's, again, a cascading series of reasoning here. On Epicurus' second point, this is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. If matter is all that there is, and consequently the sum of our existence, to quote Brad Pitt as it was put as Achilles in Troy, the gods envy us. They envy us because we're mortal, because any moment may be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we're doomed, You will never be more lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. There he's speaking to the love interest of the film. If matter is all there is, and consequently the sum of our existence, then whatever a personal God were to do to us in affecting our maximal satisfaction, or cutting short, or drastically affecting our lives mortally, would be essentially cruel.
Yeah.
However, if our more significant existence was to be perhaps spiritual and physical, holistically aligned, fully aligned, and eternal, then however we view our mortal existence needs to be reframed.
Yeah.
See, there is a view of theism that actually holds that God is capricious and vengeful, that he is malevolent. I was thinking about this recently in preparation of this cast, actually, and actually perhaps this is why in Indian or Greek pantheons there are like non-virtuous gods, and perhaps why this actually makes sense. Because it's actually a theological exercise to personify God and seeking to humanize him, because actually we're seeking to make sense of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like there's in these different religions when you've got Zeus being just like this serial rapist and just like an awful deity, very capricious and vengeful, if we're talking about the Greek pantheon.
Yeah.
Or like this variety, like literally millions of Indian gods, of which there are some who are morally upstanding and virtuous, and some that are just vengeful and very not morally upstanding, very morally reprehensible, right? We see that I think there's a sense in actually with trying to make sense of our own experience by actually looking at what we expect of divinity. I think again it's an appeal to maybe this idea that we understand the image of God in some sense. We understand that actually in humanity is the spark of divinity, and that actually in humanity is the capacity for great good and great evil. But I would also advance the idea of the burden of proof in the atheist struggling with this argument. They need to consider the alternative. Because if there is no God, if there is no transcendence, then suffering is purely a cosmic dice roll. Your pain, if you have it personally, is meaningless. There's no actual justification for it. You just lucked out, buddy. I'm so sorry. If you have a great life of fortune and 5 people around you have cancer and die horrifically, purely your chances. And I'm sorry, I can't tolerate such a worldview that actually just says purely luck of the draw. I think that just like is such a insult to people in horrific instances of pain and suffering. I think like there has to be greater meaning to that and to people suffering than actually for it to just be purely meaningless. So then talking about a maximally great being, what about sovereignty and evil? William Lane Craig advances this idea of actually permissive evil and sovereignty computing for the most perceivable good in a reality. Like this maximally great being actually saying, how can I allow for a reality in which the volition of humanity and actually spiritual forces, there we get on to divine counsel, there I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself and actually talking about the interface of humanity and the spiritual, not all of which has goodwill towards humanity. There's a lot of ill will if we consider the spiritual realm. How can that God contending with these realities actually allow for the maximal amount of good in said reality? Yeah. I think it's that Romans 8:28, which also often is quoted in these instances. This is the verse that tells us that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, which speaks of this idea contextually in the passage about the Spirit being the seal and the confirmation of salvation, and that actually in the wider letter of Romans, suffering producing perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope, and hope does not disappoint us. This is Romans 5, but then Romans 8 giving this idea that actually God sees that bad things happen because of these matrix of possibilities in these interacting realities. But he works even in ill, even in bad, even in evil. He works towards the good of those who love him, even in such instances as these. And I think this is, again, the invitation of the greater perspective, which Achilles was kind of appealing to, but had the view of his own mortality. I think, erroneously, putting that at the forefront. See, eternity actually puts present pain in perspective. What if God allows for some evil to promote the maximum amount of good possible, given our prior point, free will? Faith, as trust, means deferring to his reasons for why he might do so. A popular example that kind of actually articulates this, Matt Damon did a film a couple of years ago called The Adjustment Bureau. And I like pop culture references for the sake of evangelism, because we see in that film there are these guys in fedoras and suits, essentially being angels, making adjustments to people's lived realities, taking their free will and, intervening to actually put them on the right path in alignment with a greater plan, with a greater will. And so there's this idea that perhaps actually God is working, both the free knowledge, I forget the three categories, the free knowledge, the middle knowledge, and the natural knowledge, thank you, that actually God, knowing of this, knowing of all the possibilities, knowing of the interaction of these said realities, that he's actually trying to allow for the most amount of good possible in the same time. So then our third point from Epicurius is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? I'm actually going to read directly from my blog again. There's a couple of points I've quoted. I'll quote from this point again. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? So in the ancient story of Job in the Old Testament, part of the wisdom literature of the Tanakh, the old Torah, the wisdom writings, and the prophets, considered also probably the most ancient book of the Bible, the issue of consequence that people often miss in the story of Job is that in Hasatan, the accuser, and Satan, that's what Satan means in the original Hebrew, visiting and addressing God in the first two chapters, Satan was actually challenging God's right to declare people righteous based upon their faith in him to provide propitiation. And that's a challenge that strikes right at the heart of the gospel of Christianity, in that God can declare people perfect, can declare people righteous based on the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Basically, you've got Satan pointing at the finger and saying, you can't call Job righteous, because if you do this, he will show his true character. And then therefore, it's the faith that actually is the atoning merit of Job. Basically, you've got actually God saying, yes, I can, because you don't know the means ultimately by which I will declare people righteous. The greater plan of salvation being in panoramic view of God. See, we as people, all as people, look at this life as if this is all that is. However, theism in its various expressions reason otherwise, saying, in him we live and move and have our being. This is Paul speaking in Athens and quoting Greek poets to evangelize to his audience. Most also further express the problem of our existence as the result of a disunity or a chaos or a rupture in how things were created to be, as any worldview worth its salt must acknowledge that something is not right. Where does evil come from? Just like Epicurus put it. With the world. Something is not right with the world, and therefore propose the solution. In a Judeo-Christian worldview, that is sin, but the Bible is all about detailing the plan of fixing that problem in the process of articulating man's origin and resulting destiny. The point I'm trying to make here is that sin has created this chaotic rippling of cause and effect that is reverberated through all of creation. And sin is a product of free will used, and thus the possibility of man using his unwisely. The awful things that sometimes happen to us are a result of that sin in creation, which I believe sometimes God allows maybe even sometimes directs or wills. I think there are instances in scripture we could talk about this. We're talking about Pharaoh, and that's often the instances that's quoted, where Pharaoh hardened his heart in the first 5 plagues that happened in Egypt, and in the remaining 5 plagues, God hardened his heart. That's a whole other podcast we could talk about what was being accomplished here. I do not believe in a capricious or negligent God, but I do believe in a God that uses all things for his purposes, and those can be as myriad as there are people in the world, and further relationships of those people to each other. It is one of the many reasons that theists pray, as they are appealing to deity to intervene and change the circumstances, as it is deity's power to do. See, I think that if we can put this down to 3 causes, actually, what causes pain? Pain can come from us, pain can come from God's permission of pain, or pain can come from the enemy. There are 3 parties, not one in isolation, that actually this can be accomplished by. Where does evil come from? Well, we actually have an enemy, as the Bible actually articulates, that is intent on spiting God, intent on defeating God, intent on actually doing everything he can, to defy the purposes of God, spite the purposes of God, disrupt, cause confusion, chaos, disarray to the purposes of God. So on that point, you can actually see that it's not that we can just put it at the feet of God. We have to acknowledge our own participation. We need to acknowledge the enemy's participation. Talking about actually the 3 parties of consequence, we also need to remember the example of Jesus and how he came to heal and save. What then should Christians, his body, be in the business of doing? And I genuinely wonder this. This is something I'd like to work out the answer to. But does our omission of good actually lead to more evil and suffering, given the body's commission, what we've been asked to do? Some of Jesus' final words to us in Matthew 28. But I digress on that point. Just while still staying with this, is he both evil and willing? And where does evil come from? We may notice and concur that many of the explanations of dire circumstances in Hebrew scriptures are provided to us postscript and posthumously. I think we think about the likes of Lamentations. We think about the likes of a lot of the prophetic books written from really horrific circumstances.
Yeah.
I find an incredible degree of empathy in that, as that it is exactly what the human experience of suffering is like. Even today, as I look back on my own personal testimony of pain and suffering, I don't have all the answers to why different episodes happen. But by what God has done in my life, he has enabled me to be formed in character by those instances and not defined by any of them. In particular, when I came to God regarding one sin against me and why, even naturally or supernaturally, he could not have intervened to help me instantaneously, he spoke to me to say that Christ died for all and not just for me. That his punishment was sufficient for all who call on him, and that because of that, their sin has been paid for. I relinquish my claim to justice in Christian faith because that has been settled, and that a man named Jesus died for the crimes of those who now call upon him. And for those who don't, there is a justice in a coming judgment for those who don't accept the free offer of grace, which is sufficient for all. I think it's the perfect balance, and we'll talk more about that in the following podcast, on the moral argument of respect for human volition, but also the need for a balancing that against the need for justice. And it's a good lead in to talking about actually is Epicurius' statement of, is he neither willing nor able, then why call him God?
Yeah.
Hearing a conversation between Sean McDowell and Preston Sprinkle recently on their YouTube, on Sean McDowell's YouTube channel, Popular Christian Apologist, he mentioned Jonathan Haidt, how previously in thinking about actually good and evil, he had this view of morality as just being actually in terms of what is actually caring and what is harm, and how that was previously his worldview before he actually went to India And actually, from his trip to India, Jonathan Haidt, who is a respected psychologist in the States, he behavioral psychologist. He's atheistic, to my understanding, Jewish background, but holds a quite a conservative stance and advances this idea of actual behavioral ethics from a evolutionary standpoint. What was interesting is in his trip to India is part of where actually his work with the 6 moral pillars, which he's known for, actually came from. And these 6 moral pillars actually talk about not just care and harm in terms of actually what is right and wrong. See, we in the West, we typically only sustain morality from that first pillar, actually what is caring and what is harm, at the expense of the others. But Haidt actually mentions as many as 6, talking about, say, actually there's a need for fairness as opposed to cheating. There's a need for actual morality in terms of loyalty versus betrayal. There's a need for morality in terms of authority versus subversion. There's a need for morality in terms of sanctity versus degradation. There's a need for morality in terms of liberty versus oppression. And so we actually see that even in terms of our lived experience, when we talk about this ontology argument and we talk about the problem of pain, that actually even morality itself is not just to be viewed as, oh, that is bad for me, that is inconvenient for me, that is uncomfortable for me. In our lived experience on a day-to-day basis, there's at least 5 other domains which we actually think in terms of morality. I'll link in the description a summary of some of those ideas as they're talked about, but most religions actually encounter those ideas in terms of morality. And linking right back to what I'm saying here, when we talk about actually is God neither willing nor able to actually intervene in these instances, then why call him God? Again, Christ presents a unique counter perspective. As the incarnational Logos, we've got Christ weeping at the death of his friend. We've got the Christ who actually spent his point of human experience a lot of his time healing and creating liberation in the lives of people. You must imagine, as the creator, as the Logos, as John 1 verse 1 to 3 details and tells us, he must have been saying, I never created it to be this way. And he truly empathized then with those who actually have ever experienced pain, but he also had a unique perspective as that said creator. Neither did he do nothing about it. Limited as he was as a human, he proceeded to model the kind of life and method of living he would want us to live, to alleviate and address this problem of pain. He healed and he fed and he taught and he loved and he did miracles and he saved lives. I want people to see, the audience listening, to actually see that Jesus, as the God of the Christian faith, displays God's heart towards suffering and the method of addressing it. God as sovereign means a humility under his prerogative to do as he wills. It's not a popular doctrine, but it is my hope that in this cast in entirety we'll attempt to explain some of the reasons God has for doing as he wills and hopefully representing him well. Certainly in terms of the exact representation of the unknowable God, as Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1 to 3 shows us, is Christ. But also inviting you to see that actually maybe this grander reality of eternity helps us to put things into perspective. On 4 closing points on this argument, if there is more to our existence than simply what we empirically perceive, 1, is it all God's fault if sin is in the heart of every person, and that accounts for so many of the horrors we commit against each other? 2, would not God be better to direct our attention to something better, something greater than this by any means? 3, does not Jesus show us God's heart towards suffering and his commitment to do something about it in a fixed period of time and presently through Christians and ultimately through his atoning work? And 4, if the reality beyond meant an end to suffering and pain, could that be the means by which we might be able to look past and present pains and circumstances? It may even enable us to be the means of grace and life to others in pain as we firstly empathize with others, saying we know what it's like to hurt too, but also there is hope for more than just this life. Put another way, it reminds me of two of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, which is actually in Revelation 22, verse 3 and 4. 21, verse 3 and 4. Which says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God." This is basically a verse that is echoed throughout Scripture. This idea that actually I will be their God, and they will be my people. This is a promise that's actually echoed all throughout Scripture, that actually God's presence will be once again with humanity. So at the end of the Bible, it's fitting that this should be reminded again. Actually, Jews and Gentiles now in the new heavens and the new earth are reminded right at the end of Revelation, right at the end of the book, that actually this is the intended purpose of God, and actually the humanity project, the creation project. And verse 4, like a real fitting, touching note on, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
Hey, 2s and 3s, that's us for the first part of the 9 arguments from Theism. Jared and I were originally going to split this off into 2 parts, but it ended up being quite the fun one, and we decided to do 3 arguments in 3 parts. So we started off with the Kalam Cosmological Argument, moved on to the argument of Contingency, and finished up with the Ontological Argument. Tune in next week for 3 more arguments for Theism. Like if you liked it, subscribe and comment.